Today on TimesCast, the House Ethics Committee finds Charles Rangel guilty of ethics violations.
Like down there is where they gotta be.
President Obama awards the Medal of Honor to a living soldier, a first since the Vietnam War. And a look at Apple's announcement today.
Sam, Representative Charlie Rangel has now been convicted on most of the charges by this House Ethics panel. What does this mean for him immediately?
Well, what it means is that the full panel will now deliberate on a penalty recommended to the House of Representatives, which then has to vote on that penalty. The most likely penalty is probably going to be some form of reprimand or censure. They could also fine him. They could also somehow reduce his privileges in the House. One highly unlikely alternative is expulsion. That would take a 2/3 vote of the full House, and that seems pretty far-fetched at this point.
Okay, so Representative Rangel probably won't be kicked out of the House, as you say, but what are the possible repercussions for him politically with Congress and in his home district?
Well, I think Congress would like to see a little bit of contrition, but remember, Congressman Rangel is now going into a Congress in which the Democrats are now in the minority. He has already lost his chairmanship of the House Ways and Means Committee, something that he had coveted in many of his years in the House of Representatives. And back home, he was just reelected this month to a full 2-year term by his district. Presumably his last term. If he retires, he is 80 years old. He served 40 years in the House. And keep in mind that his predecessor, the man he beat, Adam Clayton Powell, when the House of Representatives refused to seat him in 1967, Powell went back at a special election, ran, and won. This district tends to be forgiving.
On Tuesday afternoon, Staff Sergeant Sal Junta becomes the first living soldier to receive the Medal of Honor since the Vietnam War. It's the highest military award in the country. In 2007, New York Times Magazine contributing reporter Elizabeth Rubin was embedded with Junta's company in Afghanistan's Korengal Valley when a Taliban ambush killed his friend and fellow soldier Josh Brennan, who always insisted on walking at the front of his platoon.
We were spread out across the mountain, and then we could hear them screaming over the radio, "We need help, 5 men down." Junta is with some other guys. He gets hit, and he realizes Brennan isn't there, and he runs into the dark to find Brennan, who's being taken off by Taliban, and he shoots the Taliban, and he runs to Brennan to try and save his life. Brennan was badly wounded in the jaw and like 6 or 7 gunshot wounds, and they started dressing him. They called for a medevac. Then this hoist came out of the sky, a medevac hoist, and took him away. The next morning I went up to the OP to find Junta. Already at that time he knew that they were putting him up for the Medal of Honor, and he was very conflicted and basically angry about it, because this award, this medal, comes at the expense of 3 men's lives. Larry Rugel, Hugo Mendoza, Josh Brennan, they were all killed during Rock Avalanche. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like an ordinary soldier who just ran to find his friend.
Today, Apple announced that after years of negotiations, iTunes is now selling Beatles music.
So Apple's announcement today, it's not the iPhone 5 in terms of, the relative scale of Apple's announcements. It's pretty small.
I think it's a symbolic victory for Apple, if nothing more. I mean, it's important for them. It's important for Steve Jobs, who's been a big sort of public Beatles fan for a long, long time now. And I think probably, having exclusive rights to the biggest selling music act of all time on your digital platform is something that they can be very, excited about and use. For PR purposes.
And the dispute between Apple and EMI, the Beatles record label, has been going on for some 30 years.
Oh yeah, it goes back almost to the founding of Apple Computer, which had to basically get permission from Apple Corps, which was the Beatles company that administered their record label, to use the name Apple. And the agreement they came to back then, funnily enough, said, fine, you can be called Apple Computer, you just can't really be involved in the music business.
So the Beatles is one of the biggest selling bands of all time. I mean, how much money will this make Apple?
Probably not all that much, right? I mean, iTunes doesn't really make Apple a lot of money on its own. iTunes is probably a break-even business, and it exists so that more people will buy iPods and iPhones, and those things make a lot of money for Apple. But selling music itself, not a really big deal.
Join us again tomorrow for TimesCast.